Ladies and gentlemen, if we can get seated, we'll get started. Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a dreary Monday in our nation's capital. But I guess we're a little lucky in that it could be 5 inches of snow outside. But if you are living, I guess, a few miles from here north, you probably do have that. But I think that's kept away some of our people here today. But I appreciate all of you coming out here today and taking part in our first noon forum edition for 2014. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Nick Larigakis. I'm president of the American Hellenic Institute. And the American Hellenic Institute is a nonprofit Greek-American public policy center. And it's my pleasure to present our noon forum today, which is titled, Pogrom Against Christians Sweeps Middle East. What is the state of religious minorities in Turkey? The topic we are examining today, unfortunately, does not get much play in the American mainstream media. Those of us who are interested and must resort to overseas news broadcasts or to specific news websites or blogs to read about the sad state of affairs that Christians are facing as a result of war and unrest in the Middle East. For example, Orthodox Christians are well aware that Orthodox bishops were abducted in Syria last April, and more recently, about 12 nuns. In December, Pope Francis called for prayers for these nuns, and these are only numerous about the fate of the bishops, one of which may still be alive, possibly held in Turkey, which transitions us to a focus on Turkey as today's focus forum asks. What is the state of religious minorities in Turkey? Many of us in the audience are aware of the plight of the ecumenical patriarchate, recognition of its ecumenical status, issues of succession, the closure of Halki Seminary, and the confiscation of hundreds of pieces of its property, among other violations. However, a read of the annual religious freedom reports on Turkey from the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom or the State Department will find that it is not just Orthodox Christians, Greek or Armenians, that struggle in Turkey, but the broad spectrum of religions that are minorities there, including Catholics, Jews, Protestants, Syriacs, and Alawi Muslims. To help share more insight and expertise about today's important topic, I am pleased to introduce as our guest speaker a very good friend of the American Hellenic Institute, Doug Bandow, who is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. Just a little bit about Mr. Bandow. As I said, he is a senior fellow at Cato, specializing in foreign policy and civil liberties. He worked as a special assistant to President Reagan and editor of the political magazine Inquiry. He writes regularly for leading publications such as Fortune magazine, National Interest, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Times. Mr. Bandow speaks frequently at academic conferences, on college campuses, and to business groups. He has been a regular commentator on ABC, CBS, NBC, and practically every form of medium out there. He holds a JD from Stanford University, and he likes to present only a very short bio, but believe me, there's a lot more to this man than this short page of his bio. It is a great pleasure to introduce for today's forum, Mr. Doug Bandow. Doug?
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to come. I thank all of you for turning out on what is a rather dreary day, but that there's still policy to conduct and issues to debate, and I hope that my discussion today can at least lead to some thoughts about an important issue out there. And if we look at the Middle East today, what we see is a lot of conflict, and one of the important issues, as Nick indicated, that doesn't get a lot of attention is the plight of religious minorities, particularly Christians, who go back thousands of years. What we have is what had once been a very diverse region in terms of religious beliefs that is very much narrowing down. And I think that there's kind of a good and bad news as we think about Turkey in terms of where it stands within the region. But I think in many ways, much of what we see with Turkey, I think, is a lost opportunity, which still could be picked up, which I think would be beneficial for Turkey as well as religious minorities in the region. As Nick indicated, if you look throughout the Middle East, we do see what I think can accurately be described as kind of a pogrom, whether or not it's planned or not, against Christians. We see individual Christians who are murdered. We see mobs of militants destroying homes and businesses and churches. We see, kind of facilities being torched. We see people discriminated against. We see governments carrying out varying activities, prosecutions for blasphemy, for example, discrimination when it comes to marriage and conversion, prosecutions of converts, kind of constraints on church construction and worship, and a failure very often to prosecute private violence. The horror cases that are out there, it's Iraq, which after the U.S. invasion, a half or more of the historic Christian community has been forced out of its homes, many of them actually to Syria. I mean, these are people who have kind of been pushed into what is now a vortex of violence, others displaced within Iraq itself to Kurdish areas and elsewhere. We see Syria, where we see targeting of individual Christians. We see attacks on communities where Christians are concentrated. Extraordinary fears. We've seen the rise of jihadists among the opposition. That very hard to know if you're a Christian living in Syria, and you like democracy. The question is, what position do you take? You have an authoritarian government, but you have many rebels who'd be quite happy to kill you. This is not a very good choice to make. And imagine having been in Iraq, fleeing to Syria to try to escape the depredations in Iraq, and suddenly finding yourself in the middle of all this. We see extraordinary problems in Egypt. These are not new. There's no illusion here that suddenly it was only the Brotherhood that caused problems here. Go back to the Mubarak dictatorship. This is a long-standing persecution of discrimination against Copts in terms of identity, in terms of marriage, in terms of conversion, in terms of churches. And we've seen after the coup d'etat and the blame, I think, that many Muslims have placed on the Coptic Church, we've seen an upsurge of violence and not very strong protection from the government. And if you range just a little further, say go to Pakistan, known for its use of the blasphemy law against Christians and Muslims as well, but particularly against Christians, and used very often in property disputes and anything else, as well as religious. Private violence, destruction of churches, attacks on Christians. There's a lot going on that if you kind of look at this mosaic, it's very ugly for this historic faith. And I think that Turkey is not in those category, thankfully. Turkey is not in the realm of mass slaughter, killings, and destruction. But I think what we see is Turkey is taking on a regional and a leadership role could do so much more, that it is not nearly as good as it should be, that in fact the problems there are ones that it should be willing to take on, especially if it aspires to a much larger role, that indeed there's a real opportunity there, I would argue, for Turkey to be a model. What we see are problems of social discrimination and private violence. We see government discrimination on public service, in terms of education, schools. We see disabilities, particularly of Orthodox churches, in question of monasteries in terms of education and property ownership. And there is, to some degree, and we see kind of the debate within Turkey itself, the question of where the Erdogan government is going, a kind of a rise to some degree of, it seems, authoritarian response on the political side and elsewhere that's going to have an impact. Concerns about essentially kind of the coding of individuals by religion, use of identity cards. If you look at both State Department report as well as the report of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, both of them point out areas that I think one has to be concerned about. For example, the State Department, in its report that came out last year, noted that the ban on headscarves, what that does in terms of religious expression, that some religious groups face restrictions registering with the government, owning property, training their members in clergy. While religious and speech conversions are legal, some Muslims, Christians, and Baha'is face restrictions, surveillance, and occasional harassment for proselytizing or providing religious instruction. It noted reports of societal abuses and discrimination based on religious affiliation, and these reach beyond Christians. Baha'is throughout the Middle East, countries like Iran and elsewhere, are very often and often more vilified and treated even worse because they're viewed in certain ways as apostates and not people of the book. And also kind of the kind of minority Islamic populations here, the Alevis and Jewish leaders reported some elements continue to express anti-Semitic sentiments, which we've seen publicized. And then it goes on and it notes, reports of imprisonment of a conscientious objector, local government officials not enforcing constitutional guarantees, restrictions on religious expression in different areas. Some religious groups reported difficulties opening, maintaining, and operating houses of worship. Something very important, of course, for a religious community, especially if it's a minority faith, to have that kind of place where one can meet and be safe and worship. Many local officials continue to impose zoning standards on churches that get in the way. Syrian Orthodox community continue to seek a second church in Istanbul. Non-Turkish citizens may not receive degrees from licensed community schools. It's placed a real burden on Armenians, for example, in the question of education there. Governments place significant restrictions on a number of Greek Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, Syrian Orthodox, and other churches and the operations of those churches. Many prosecutors and police regard religious speech and religious activism with suspicion. And we see kind of as part of this larger authoritarian climate how the issue of prosecutions is a very important one. It's been turned against the government. Now the government has essentially launched a campaign against the police. I mean, this is a very politicized area where religious minorities are vulnerable. Many foreign Protestants, Mormons, and religious workers are unable to obtain or renew residence permits. Government occasionally brings blasphemy charges, which very often are used abusively. Discrimination, some violence, threats against different parties. Similar reports coming out of the U.S. Commission talking about Turkish government's interpretation of secularism requires absolute state control over all aspects of religion in the public square. No religious community has full legal status, which limits their rights to own and maintain places of worship, train clergy, offer religious education. And indeed, this, of course, is an area of particular concern to the Orthodox churches in terms of coming out of the formation of Turkey and kind of that violent creation and everything that came with that. The State Department notes the Armenian and ecumenical Greek Orthodox communities continue to seek legal recognition for their patriarchs. The Greek Orthodox Ecumenical Patriarchate continue to seek to reopen Halki Seminary. These are issues which have not been addressed. Government continued not to recognize the status of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. The foundations reported they were frequently rebuffed in efforts to acquire and restore ruined churches. That these things have an impact on the operation of religious minorities within Turkish society. And it's interesting, there have been indications from the Erdogan government of a willingness to deal with some of these things. Indeed, I want to emphasize there have been positive developments in Turkey, one of which is return of some properties that had been seized. 100 years ago, 80 years ago, there has been a return, that there has been some movement on that in very important ways. And that I think the government has to be recognized for, that it has relaxed some of the kind of secularist restrictions coming out of the prior era. But the Erdogan government suggested some interest in, for example, solving the issue of Halki, but it suggested, among other things, perhaps reciprocity, bringing in the question of Greece and how Greece deals with its Islamic community. And I think that the problem here is it is a legitimate issue to discuss. What does Greece do? What are its responsibilities? But that has nothing to do with human rights within Turkey. The question of how one treats one's own citizens, whether one allows one to open and have a seminary or have a monastery, these are issues which really come out of basic human rights law within one's own society. These are not issues of legal reciprocity. The question is, how should you treat your own citizens? Recognizing them, recognizing the importance of their own religious activities, giving them the opportunity. This really is an issue of Turkey in terms of how it treats its own people, those who live within it, those who claim the protections of that government. And Turkish claims to greater regional leadership, I think, really suggest that it should take a role here in improving the status of religious minorities. And the fact that there has been some positive movement, I think, gives us hope, and my hope would be that this is something to call upon the Erdogan government, that if it has kind of claims to leadership, that what it needs to do is make movement in this case. That if it wants global and regional leadership, if it wants to take a role, increasing role within the international community, this is one of those areas where I think right of conscience, freedom of conscience, the exercise of, our view of the transcendent, answering to our Creator. Now, this is about the most basic form of freedom of conscience that one can have. And I argue it's kind of like the canary in the mine, that if you're not willing to recognize and accept that, if you're not willing to allow people to respond to the deepest impulses, it's very hard to imagine you will actually protect freedom of speech, political expression, and other things. That those things are very important, but they're kind of a step away from that very basic sense of answering to the transcendent. And Turkey, I think, is in a sense, at the moment, trying to kind of find a way between two extremes. If you look at persecution around the world today, there really are two poles that typically are the worst persecution. One of which is the secular extremism that comes from typically communist and former communist states. I mean, you want to see the ugly stuff, it's North Korea. I mean, you see Cuba, you see China, I mean, you see Vietnam today. I mean, these are all places, like you see some of the Central Asian republics. I mean, all these things, they're overhangs of communism, or at least purported communism today, tend to be very, very vicious in the treatment of people who basically want to step away and say there's another God. The other pole are the kind of ruthless Islamic states, where one thinks of Iran, one thinks of Saudi Arabia, one thinks of what's going in Iraq today, though recognizing that's not just the government, it's actually beyond the government. But where what you find is a religious society that essentially wants to suppress any alternative religion, including Muslims of a different belief. Well, Turkey long had that kind of Kemalist, ruthless secularism, which applied not only to kind of Muslims, but it applied to Christians and others. And that it's been moving away from, and the question is, where is it going? What we've seen is more Islamic expression within Turkish society. The question is, where is this government going? And I think what's critically important then is for it not to move towards that other pole. And that's the one that has a lot of people nervous because no one's quite sure where things are moving. And to me, that's the challenge for Turkey, is to recognize that it can have a society that's largely Islamic. It can have a society that has Islamic expression. It has a kind of a culture and kind of a whole polity which is going to have the aspects that come out of it being Islamic. But that doesn't mean that one has to suppress the activities of the beliefs of religious minorities. That one can have a society like that and give the space to those within one's own community, for that diversity of opinion. And to me, that's what really makes kind of the potential leadership for Turkey very important. It's certainly in a model that the U.S. has tried to follow, which I think some success, allowing extraordinary diversity, even though overall it would be perceived as a Christian society. I think of a Turkey that aspires to regional global leadership. I think of a Turkey that may still, presumably to some degree, aspire to be part of Europe. A Turkey that wants to be successful economically and a power within the region. A Turkey that itself, leaders have gone through and seen the abuses. One thinks of Erdogan, who spent time in prison. I mean, he's been punished for his religious beliefs in the past. Certainly should have a personal recognition of the importance of limiting how the government itself can be abused, and how those who hold minority faiths can suffer at the hands of the state. That all of those together, I think, suggest that Turkey should move in a much more positive direction. It has that opportunity. And again, this is not an issue of reciprocity. It's not a political issue to work out among foreign ministries. This is a matter, I think, of human rights. It's a matter of what a decent society is, especially one that wants to be on the world stage. It's a question of what a society is that wants to kind of go forward, be a participant of major international organizations. And I would like to see, we long hear discussion of, is Turkey the model for other Islamic societies? A democratic society, a society that can kind of provide that option away from whether it be a Pakistan or a Saudi Arabia. Is Turkey the one that can kind of make that work? It can be a relatively free society that can have democratic political practices, maintain an Islamic character. One can argue about how well it's done that. My guess is some people in this room would probably argue differently in terms of how well it is done. But to do that, it strikes me, an essence of that is the acceptance of and protection of those who are most vulnerable, which happen to be religious minorities. Those who are most likely to be subject to societal abuse, discrimination, mistreatment, those who are most likely to lose in courts, those who are most likely to be victimized by local officials. All of those things are most likely to occur against people who are seen as different ethnically, seen as different religiously, seen as not having major support networks. In that case, then, I think Turkey has an obligation, and doing that would allow itself to hold itself up as a model, especially at a time where today it's under increasing criticism. What does Erdogan want? Where is the government going? All of these issues being debated very vigorously. This is a touchstone issue where I would suggest that if Turkey moved in a positive direction, that Turkey, in fact, could gain not only, I think, the moral high ground in terms of what it should do, but it could also gain politically as part of what I presume would be a larger foreign policy agenda that they have. There's obviously, I think, a limit in terms of what those outside of Turkey can do. This is not an issue where one can imagine the EU or the United States can essentially make Turkey do anything. However, I think it's important, that kind of be in the mix of discussion, that Turkey understand these are issues that resonate within American and I would hope European society. That if Turkey wants to play a role, if it wants to have good friendship, if it wants to have alliance relationships, these kind of things do matter. And Americans, certainly of religious persuasions, see this and worry about that, and it matters to them. as they judge the efficacy of an alliance, as they judge those sorts of relationships, making an effort to protect religious minorities and doing better at that, I think, is something that would strengthen the friendship and relationships across oceans and across land masses, that in a way that we may lack today, where people in fact see their co-religious, they see people with whom they share a lot, suffering in ways that don't seem in any way to advance Turkish national interest, vital interest. I mean, there's none of that there. We can't see what Turkey loses by reopening a seminary or reopening a monastery. I mean, what on earth does Turkey lose? This is not a case where one can imagine Turkey making some national security argument. These are very easy things to grant for a society if it wants to be a better place to live, as well as be a more effective actor on the international stage. Again, religious liberty, I think, is a matter of extraordinary importance. It's always, I think, to some degree going to get short shrift in Washington. This is a very practical place. I mean, the reality is State Department has a lot on its mind. It's very hard to imagine you're going to get the Secretary of State, call him or her down and say, put this at the top of your agenda. It's very hard to go out there and say, with a long list of things that we want, whether it be Syria, whether it be this or that, to say now force these people to be free in terms of religious liberty. But it is a critical issue. And again, I come back to the notion, that sense of being the canary in the mine. That if you're looking at what a society is likely to become and where it's going, does it protect that very essence of human conscience? That, I think, we need to look at religious liberty, and we need to express that. And something beyond government, I think that's something that we as individuals, people in their communities, I think American churches and others should make that argument and make it known that we do watch, we do care, and that these are issues which Turkey could do better at addressing. And it would not only be in the interest of Turkey's religious minorities, ultimately it would be in the interests of Turkey as a nation state as well. And I'll close there. I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Doug. And I think those of you who've been here before know the drill here. Just please identify yourself and ask a question. And I'll open up the floor with a question. Yes, sir. Please identify yourself.
Sure. My name is Ahmet Sarkan. I'm a MA student here at Johns Hopkins SAIS. And thank you, Mr. Bandow, for this interesting presentation. My question is in regards to the impeding withdrawal of the U.S. and coalition force from Afghanistan, because for a long time the reason cited by the U.S. officials in order why they are not posing a lot of pressure on the Turkish counterpart was because of the northern distribution network and the wars going on in Iraq and Afghanistan. So do you think after the withdrawal by the end of this year it would provide an extra leverage for the United States and other parties to press Turkey more on these type of issues?
In theory, but I think in practice, no. Among other things, at least so far, America's relationship with Turkey, much of it is run out of the Pentagon. I mean, it's the military relationship that is very strong. And it's not the fact that nobody at the Pentagon cares about religious liberty in some theoretical sense, but that's not their agenda. I mean, the Department of Defense does not engage with the Turkish military, the Prime Minister, on base issues and other sorts of things and think in terms of, oh, by the way, why don't you open the monastery? I mean, it's just not. So part of that's bureaucratic. And the other part is, I mean, the U.S. has spent a long time viewing Turkey as kind of the essential ally. I mean, I think some of that's faded. I mean, disappointment over Turkey not opening a northern front in Iraq, other things. But I still think there's a lot of that there. So it's very hard to get, I mean, as long as you think yourself you need the other party more than they need you, which I think to some degree is the view in Washington of Turkey, it's pretty hard to put pressure on them. So I think, Afghanistan's a good excuse. I mean, say, oh, well, we'd love to, but, we're kind of busy over here. Well, when that goes, my guess is there'll be something else. Well, we've got to figure out Syria, and whatever. That's my kind of cynical reaction, but, I think, I don't expect too much.
Jim?
Jim Marquetos. This is a little broader than your specific focus, but some people say that democracy is not compatible with the strict practice of Islam. I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
I mean, part of the problem here is, there was a time one would say, is democracy compatible with Christianity? I mean, the Catholic Church at one point viewed Americanism as kind of a heresy. So, I hesitate making blanket judgments, theological judgments in terms of politics. If you look at Christendom, what did Luther say versus what did Calvin say versus what did the Anabaptists say versus, there's a lot there you can argue about practice and how things fit together. my sense is within the Islamic world that there is a lot of models out there that can work. The problem is what we see the most vigorous and violent, and ones are not, clearly not. And we can argue about what Egypt shows us. I mean, I think part of the problem in some of these is you're dealing with societies that don't have any infrastructure at all. You know, if you had an Islamic president elected into society that has had elections before, has a constitutional framework and limits on government and accountability, it might work very well. On the other hand, if you elect them and there's nothing, and then they get to create the constitution, you know, things may turn out very badly. So I wouldn't want to make, what I would say is, we have to realize there's an extraordinary tension, I think, between, at times, national interest, stability, and other things, and kind of democracy. So it's sometimes hard to promote both at once, and I think at times we probably should just shut up, because we don't control events. And the second is to recognize democracy is not the same as a liberal society. What I most want is a liberal society, of which I think democracy is an important part. But if you don't have that kind of infrastructure, you don't have that kind of social ethos, you don't have the values and kind of institutions, boy, I mean, just let people vote, really bad stuff can happen. I mean, and you just see that around the world. I mean, I think the U.S. found that out. We demanded that they have vote in the Palestinian territories, and guess what? Hamas wins. And then we're shocked and won't recognize them. Well, what looks more stupid? I mean, we demand elections, and then, oh, you elected the wrong guy. Oh, well, never mind. You know, that's a little late. So I think that U.S. policymakers need to recognize that tension more and probably be a bit more humble in approaching it and saying maybe we shouldn't be pushing quite so hard here because we really don't know what's going to happen and what the outcome will be. It could turn out to be very ugly.
Julia Cloney, in the military in Turkey has been playing a great role both in domestic and international affairs. Erdogan appeared to start trying to diminish that. What do you see the prospect of the military versus Erdogan or his successor?
It looks to me, again, I don't have particular insights within the Turkish military, but it looks to me like he has essentially taken it out of politics. And this, again, is one of these tensions. I mean, there are some Americans, I think, who wish the military would do more, but military rule in Turkey was ugly. I mean, they had multiple coups d'etats. I have a friend over there who's kind of a liberal Islamic journalist. He remembers visiting his father in jail after the 1960 coup. After the 1960 coup, they executed the elected prime minister. I mean, thousands of people ended up in jail and tortured. So one should have no kind of nostalgia for kind of military rule. You know, I mean, these guys are tough and they do whatever they think is necessary. And we look back, I think, and kind of horrified at some of those things. It's hard for me to see the military re-entering. And I think it looks to me like Erdogan played it very well, whether you like him or not. In terms of dealing with the military, I think he was very smart. He took his time. You know, he won some elections and slowly kind of moves them around and takes things out and kind of builds up this police and others around and I mean, I have trouble imagining they could do it. Among other things, I'm not convinced the troops would, at this stage, be willing to follow the orders of the generals. And I think that's another area that's probably changed. You know, he's won 3 elections. I mean, this is a guy who, there's a lot of people who don't like him, but he does have a pretty strong base of support, and I suspect a lot of those people are in the military. So suddenly it's no longer so easy to call out the troops and say surround the prime minister's residence. In which way will they turn their guns, you know, if they turn out?
Hi, Nick Klesis. Could you comment on the cleavages right now in Turkish society? I mean, for example, you have Erdogan's party. You have this imam up in Pennsylvania, Mr. Jul. And I took a look at Mr. Jul's website, and in it there was some statements about how in Islamic societies that non-Muslims had to pay a tax, just like, I think an Islamic custom. And actually, it didn't look very pleasant for Christians, even according to his stuff. But yet this person is held out as somebody that is pro-European, very liberal. And another aspect, and you talked about a journalist, I've been looking at Al Monitor, and sometimes I pick up reports from Hurriyet, but in English language. And you see some really remarkably, liberal and pro-minority type sentiments voiced by columnists. So, it's not a monolithic society by any means. And so where do you see all these things kind of gelling together or going?
Well, we can attest to that by the conference we attended in Berlin. Yes. It was International Religious Freedom Conference sponsored by the Archons, of which the topic was breaking down walls, Berlin walls. tying it in, with the religious minority issues there. And there was a whole panel. We had like 7 or 8 minorities from Turkey represented on this particular panel. And it was fascinating, at least for me, to hear how openly they were expressing themselves regarding some of the problems that they're facing there. But go ahead, Doug.
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, there clearly is, and one of the problems I think we face as Americans and Westerners, and it's not just that. I mean, it's if you go to Kiev, who do you talk to? You talk to the English-speaking folks who like the West. You don't go out to the East and talk to the Russian speakers who like Russia. If you go to Iran, you hang out in Tehran and talk to the English speakers. You don't go out to the countryside and talk to people who are speaking Farsi. Well, so if you go to Turkey, do you go out to Van? Do you go to the areas out east? Do you go to the very traditional areas? I mean, I visited some on a tourist trip, and women there dress very differently than they dress in Istanbul. Trust me. I mean, this is a society that has within it. So I think one of the divisions is, I mean, you go to Istanbul, particularly, you go to kind of the more tourist areas, you see a very Western-oriented, multicultural, sophisticated world. Ankara, it's a very political world. It's less than that. I mean, but it's still a lot of folks show up. But again, you go out to the countryside, you see a very different world. And I think that's where Erdogan's gotten a lot of his support. Is that folks who traditionally were kind of not really represented or not represented well, and weren't that active. They didn't have somebody speaking on their behalf. So that's one of the divisions. You have the nationalists who kind of represent the Kemalist heritage. I mean, they're the main opposition party now. Well, they're not particularly good from, I think, a Western standpoint. These are not, wimpy liberals who believe in freedom of speech. I mean, these are people who basically ran the place for a long time and were happy to suppress anybody who got in the way. I mean, if you criticized Ataturk, I have a friend who almost lost his job as an academic. He simply said, we should rethink the Kemalist ideology. Oh, my goodness. They threatened to prosecute him. They threatened to, So these guys are not also really our friends. You do have some real liberals. I mean, in a broad, and I don't mean kind of American liberals, but in a broad sense of believing in freedom of speech and a more open society. A lot of them in academia, columnists, media, and elsewhere. And they are free to express themselves, but what's interesting is to see what's happened over the last 3 or 4 years. And I have a lot of friends there who early on were very happy with Erdogan because he's taking down this Kemalist kind of suppression and whatnot. The last 2 or 3 years, suddenly it's like, ooh. Suddenly, these other sorts of threats are coming in, threats against like the owner of the paper. If you criticize, suddenly everybody gets a little more nervous. They've gone after some of the TV owned by other businessmen. So suddenly some of that freedom has been. So you find a lot of liberals now who are suddenly very nervous about Erdogan. They don't like the nationalists, but Erdogan is suddenly no longer going the direction that they wanted, even within Erdogan's party. I mean, there's a real, I think, sense, and it's hard to know if you're not part of the process, but a real sense, I mean, Erdogan has the grassroots as the guy who's brought them to power. But there are certainly folks around President Gül and others who, especially after the recent stuff, suddenly are wondering, this is the new kind of caliph or something. He thinks a little too highly of himself. Not only are you nervous about that with intra-party politics, but you also think that might cost you the next election. Because, he won the last election of like 50 point, I don't know what. He basically got, a hair over a majority. It's not as, as long as you're dealing with kind of these parties that are a wreck, and there you have to get, I think, 10% of the vote to be represented. So if you have small parties, they don't even show up. You can dominate. But if they get a real opposition, they could lose. So I think there's a real tension there, and most people I talk to think Erdogan's not going to be able to remake the system. He wanted to make it into a presidential system. Mm-hmm. Under party rules, you can be prime minister 3 times. He's there. So suddenly the idea was, okay, let's turn all the power over to the president, and then I get to be president. All the protests and stuff seem to have, sapped a lot of the support for that. The Gulen movement, coming out of the guy in Pennsylvania, it's an interesting, they have an office in town. They're active. My sense for them is they're Islamists, but they're not particularly politically repressive. They're certainly not violent. And what's interesting is they and Erdogan at one point seemed to be together, and now are very much split. So that's another tension, and I think it's a problem for Erdogan, because he has a real following. I don't know all the difference of theology and how he fits with everyone else, but there's a pretty strong network that he has. And the argument of Erdogan is he's kind of co-opted the police. He's put all these people on the police. The other ones who've been investigating cabinet members who, it turns out have money counting machines at home and all this stuff. Oh, where'd that come from? So there are a lot of fractures within the society.
But just a sort of follow up on that regarding the Gulen movement. How do you pronounce it?
Oh, actually, I mispronounced it, but anyway.
Yeah.
Well, Gul is the president. I think
Yeah,
you said
yeah,
that.
yeah, I'm
But
sorry.
Gulen, yeah.
The Gulen movement. Obviously, it's no secret that the Gulen movement was supported heavily, the AKP party, and has brought the situation where it is today. But they're completely at odds with each other.
Yes.
So isn't the argument also in play a little bit right now as to the Gulen movement, as to who's the alternative to Erdogan to support as we go down the road here to the next elections or whatever process will take place? So doesn't the Gulen movement also have that problem as well?
Oh, sure. I mean, the problem with the Gulen movement is at the moment, I mean, if you want some kind of an Islamic character, whatever it is to politics, at the moment Erdogan and the AKP are the only ones. It's not the nationalists. And at the moment there aren't any other obvious, I think, alternatives. So then what you have to do is you hope for a break perhaps within the AKP. I mean, that's the whole question of would a Gul or somebody else take Erdogan on? Well, this is when if you shoot for the king, you better get it. Right? You go after Erdogan and you lose, your career is over in that party. So I think this is where there's a lot of ferment within the AKP nervous about potential corruption, cabinet members resigning, kids of cabinet members being investigated. All this stuff's going on. But there's no obvious alternative, but there's no obvious alternative outside of the AKP. I mean, at some point, I think that maybe the main hope is the AKP splits, that there's a crack there, and you have kind of the hard and soft, and then you get much more of a debate, but I don't think we're there yet. I mean, the moment that happens, I mean, everything explodes.
Stephen Shore, can Turkey really make progress in dealing with its religious minorities until it accepts the reality of the Armenian Holocaust?
Well, I think the answer is yes, but these things tend to get tied together. That is. I mean, I've always thought, to my mind, the obvious answer for Ankara would be to say, look, we're not the Ottoman Empire. It's gone. Yeah, it did some really, really awful stuff. We're the Republic of Turkey. That's awful stuff. We're a very different place. And to me, that is, and I've been told maybe it's they're worried about legal liability. I don't know. I assume it's just stubbornness and other things. Because to me, that would be, and I think if they did that, they could. That is to say, look, there was a break there. Those people did a lot of awful stuff. That's why we got rid of the Ottoman Empire and created our own country. And one of the things we are doing is we will treat our religious minorities better. So I would say yes, in theory. Unfortunately, in practice, all this stuff seems to get merged together. So it's very hard for them to give one up and they won't give the other up. And it's unfortunate, because I really do think there's an answer for them that could get them out of this idiotic conundrum of trying to deny history when, I mean, why? Yeah, I mean, because you can say, we didn't do it, I mean, Erdogan wasn't around then, so admit it and move on.
Hey, Laurel Starkey, you mentioned earlier the role of co-religionists here in this country. Why do you think they're not playing any sort of role?
Look, I don't know, I go to an evangelical church. And, they're wonderful people and they care about kind of politics in America. And I've a couple times with the Sunday school and kind of at the pulpit kind of given brief remarks on religious persecution. I mean, number one, I think most Americans, bless them, have no idea of what the world is. Where are places? Right? And I can give a list of religious persecutors, and I don't know, where are they? I mean, people are kind of, and it seems so distant, and it's hard to imagine what you can do. I'm frustrated, and people who deal with religious persecution are frustrated. I mean, one of the things I've argued, and actually I have a piece I hope will be coming out soon in the Wall Street Journal, but on Iran, I mean, there's this horrible persecution that goes on there. So I've got a piece that argues if Iran is serious about a nuclear deal, now set that aside whether you want to argue about that, but assume it is, then it needs to deal with suspicion in the West, and the best way to deal with suspicion in the West would be, well, stop throwing people in jail, release some of the, and it's not just Christians, it's Baha'is and others, and it's something where that argument at best comes from people who are against sanctions and want to deal with Iran. That is, Iran's friends should be the ones who make that argument. And that would be, and religious groups could be among that, saying, we want peace, good. Now tell the Iranians the way to get to peace is treat these people better because that will create more of the climate. I don't know, I get frustrated. Because to me, we're supposed to help our brethren around the world. If these are your brothers and sisters in Christ, then you should be concerned about them. But I think part of it's just a knowledge problem. I think part of it is a sense of frustration of what can we do.
But just a follow-up, why do you think, because I think you're right about the average churchgoer, but what about the leadership?
Well, but part of
those who run on religious platforms.
Yeah, but part of it is I think about what's my minister consider. He's very much in pro-life activity. So if you ask him about politics, his focus is that. I mean, he has 9 kids. He and his wife. I mean, the kids. So abortion really offends them, and there's that sense that they can do something directly about it. And I think that's part of it. That so much of his duties are pastoral. It's the church. It's this. It's that. So then we come to politics, and a certain American hesitation about mixing politics and the church, which I think is a good one. That from the pulpit, I think, God bless him, Bill is not one to go out there and say vote Republican. I mean, because to me, that's not the place. Pulpit is not the place for it. I think he could go out there and say the world's aflame, Christians are suffering, but again, what's on his agenda in front of him day to day? And I think that's part of it. And perhaps organizations that deal with this need to do better at trying to figure out a way to educate American pastors. But part of it is American. It's so decentralized. While Orthodox and Catholic churches are more hierarchical. I mean, how do you do Baptists? I mean, every church is kind of independent. My church doesn't belong to anything else. I mean, it's an independent church under, with elders and whatever. That's accountability, but there's nobody else. Not like somebody else can send out a missive to, 1,000 independent evangelical churches. And I think that's probably part of it. Of how do you reach all these different places and try to get them to recognize how important it is and what they can do.
Allow me to close out our session here today. Doug, we hear the words from politicians, government officials, policymakers, think tank people, media, and so forth. Religious freedoms, or lack of, human rights violations. And it's all a punchline to get elected and to be able to get their personal agenda across. And we, in the Western world at least, and that's all I can equate myself to, is that again, we use these again for political punchlines and for political expediency, not realizing that every time we use those words, there's real human suffering behind that's going on. You mentioned some of it today. You can go to all sorts of human rights violations. We're not going to change what's going on right now, the United States, regarding Syria, where we don't have any diplomatic relations. We don't know what's going on. We don't know who to deal with. We're certainly not in Iran. Certainly some other places. Saudi Arabia, we probably, we could use an upper hand if we wanted to. We choose not to, and so forth and so on. But Turkey, I think, is an exception. And there, I think it's much more egregious on behalf of how U.S. policy impedes upon Turkey on some of the matters that we talked about here today. Turkey is inside the so-called Western tent. They are part of NATO. They've been a beneficiary, of U.S. military, foreign assistance, and all sorts of other goodwill and aid for decades and decades. They're an aspiring country, although you would argue maybe that's not where they want to go to, but nonetheless, they are a candidate country to be joining the European Union. One of the principal values and founders of the European Union is religious freedom, which is also that of the good old U.S. of A. So it becomes a hypocrisy when our government tries to put our brand of policy in areas around the world where we don't have any good relations with, where they're not part of the Western tent, and we can't impede and impress upon that within our own allies, those who are part of the Western tent. And Turkey, unfortunately, fills into that category. And we need to do more. The lay people, who won the Super Bowl last night? What a great game, what a lousy game. That's outside the Beltway, that's what it's all about, unfortunately. They couldn't even tell you if Hawaii was part of the United States, some of them, let alone religious freedoms and violations around the world. But those people in Washington know what goes on. They choose to look the other way. And you're either going to make it an issue or you're not going to make it an issue. And the one thing I would disagree with you on regarding Turkey, you mentioned that they made some improvements. Well, they made those improvements because some strong, conditions were placed upon them. And specifically, if you're referring to the return of an orphanage, that was because it was a decision on the European Court of Human Rights, that came down regarding Turkey. And they had no choice but to abide by it, otherwise they could have been thrown out of the Council of Europe, of the European Union, which they are a part of. So Turkey does react to external pressure. I think the last thing they need or want is the United States to come out hard against their abuses internally, domestically, regarding religious freedoms or other freedoms. But we choose not to do it. And until the time we decide to do that and show the United States that, hey, we can say this to our allies too. And we're not going to just go say it to our foes and expect them to do it when we have no proper relationships with, when our own allies, that we do have relationships with, don't do it. And that's, what I want to leave you with. And if you want to make a comment on that.
Well, I think the challenge, it comes down to one of prudence. That is, what do you think you can achieve? I tend to think it's very hard to condition things and make demands, public demands of nationalists and expect them to comply. I do think what the U.S. can do, and what should do, and what the Europeans, is this needs to be a constant issue that's raised as a matter of concern, that they understand this is something that affects the relationship. So it's not so much that you go and tell Erdogan, if you want to come visit the U.S., you better do X.
You could, though.
But often what happens there is people get their backs up, and then they dig in their heels. But if it's much more an understanding that if you really want progress on this other stuff, it would really help if X, Y, and Z happen. And to some degree, you sometimes see that, say, with China. It'd be nice if some people got released. I mean, if the president holds a press conference, I'm not going unless they release so-and-so. I mean, the Chinese are going to say, forget it. But if that thing is communicated more effectively to say, look, you want stuff out of us, we need to see some stuff. And there I think it would be helpful if the U.S. and Europe talk to each other more in terms of how can we have a consistent message. That there are, say, a half dozen things that we really would like to see within Turkey in terms of religious minorities. That message then is communicated clearly from both on how important this is for us to have a positive relationship. And there I think, in fact, you could make some real progress. That work together, communicate that, get that message across.
I agree, and the one thing I will quote here that is certainly not helpful, when Mr. Erdogan, about 2 months ago, in some forum, stated, there is no country called the Republic of Cyprus. And when that question was brought up at the State Department spokesperson, she went on to say, and I'm paraphrasing, she said, well, I don't know in what context he said that, and I don't think we would agree with that. Really? In what context? What would it be acceptable? And you don't know what your country's policy is with the Republic of Cyprus, the illegitimate government, and to send a message to Mr. Erdogan rather strongly? But it's these kind of things that continuously happen.
Sure.
And it works to the appeasement of Turkey, which embraces it to do the things that it does. Until we get more strong with Turkey, unfortunately, I don't see things changing in any dramatic fashion. And at the end of the day, that would be good for Turkey. It would be good for Greece, Cyprus, Israel, and all the areas in the region where there is so much political unrest and instability, and where these countries I just mentioned are part of the Western camp, could provide the peace and stability, and therefore the projection of U.S. interests in the region. And Turkey is a key point to that. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much for coming. Please, a big hand for Doug Bandow. And we do have some refreshments in the back, some light fare. Please partake, and look forward to having you one of our next noon forums. Thanks again for coming, and thanks, Doug. Thank you, sir.